Can I tell you about one of the strangest childhoods in American history? There was a place in America where fathers kissed their 6-year-old daughters goodbye, then disappeared beyond the horizon. The next time some of those fathers saw their daughters, they were 10 years old. And when he finally came home, no one greeted him by saying, "I'm sorry you missed her childhood." Instead, they shook his hand and congratulated him, because in Nantucket, coming home after 4 years meant you were lucky enough to come home at all. He wasn't unusual. Before one ship had even vanished into the fog, another family was already standing on the dock saying goodbye. 4 years was considered a successful voyage. Some lasted 5, a few stretched even longer, and the ones who came home the latest were often the ones the island respected. To the rest of America, that would have sounded unimaginable. On Nantucket, it was simply life. One afternoon, another child asked her why her father was always away. She frowned. She genuinely didn't understand the question. How else would we buy flour? 4 years doesn't sound very long, until you're the one waiting. When he left, she still needed help tying her shoes. By the time he'd come home, she'd lost every baby tooth, learned to read, and grown tall enough to reach the kitchen shelf by herself. At first, people asked when he'd be home. After a while, they started asking whether anyone had seen the ship. Eventually, they stopped asking altogether. They only asked whether the voyage was going well. On that island, children didn't spend their childhood wondering why fathers left. They spent it believing that's what fathers did. Somewhere beyond the harbor, her father's ship had already become a speck against the sea. She couldn't have known she'd grow from 6 to 10 before she ever saw him again. While those ships disappeared into oceans most Americans would never see, somebody still had to keep the island alive. And every evening, another child looked toward the empty horizon, believing that was simply what fathers did. What happened after that was what made Nantucket unlike anywhere else in America. The remarkable part wasn't that fathers kept leaving, it was what happened after they were gone. The first thing that disappeared wasn't the ships, it was the waiting. Generations had practiced this morning, long before Amelia was ever born. While another whale ship was still shrinking beyond Brant Point, the island had already gone back to work. The bakery opened, the cooper kept hammering, wagons rattled across the cobblestones. By the time the sails had become little more than white marks against the Atlantic, customers were already waiting outside for fresh bread. That wasn't what I expected. After everything I'd learned about fathers leaving for 4 years, I expected the island to pause, to feel quieter, to look as though something important had just been lost. Instead, the departure of another whale ship seemed to belong to the rhythm of an ordinary morning. Nobody hurried to the harbor. Nobody stood watching until the ship disappeared. It was almost as though everyone already knew exactly how the day would unfold. The voyage had begun. Now the island had its own work to do. That was the first real mystery Nantucket presented. Not how fathers could leave for so long, but how an entire town could continue as though nothing had happened. Most stories about whaling begin with the men who sailed away. Very few linger on the people who stayed behind. The farther you look, the stranger it becomes. The men are gone, yet deliveries are still being negotiated. Shops still open. Workshops stay busy. The streets never suggest that half the island's fathers have just sailed into the Atlantic. Outside one counting house, 2 merchants waited patiently. At first, it seems they're waiting for the owner. They aren't. They're waiting for his wife. A wagon driver hands her a bundle of documents. She signs them without hesitation. He thanks her, tips his hat, climbs back onto the wagon, and disappears down the street. Nobody stops to watch. The merchants never glance toward the harbor. Their business had already moved on. The more ordinary the morning becomes, the less ordinary Nantucket feels. This wasn't a town surviving despite the voyages. It was a town built around them. And if that was true, then somewhere the island had already solved a problem most of America didn't even know existed. That answer wasn't waiting at the harbor. It was hidden somewhere else. Amelia had never signed a contract. She had never stepped inside the Pacific Bank. She didn't know anything about legal authority or property rights. She only knew her mother seemed to know what to do whenever another ship disappeared over the horizon. The answer wasn't in the harbor. It was hidden inside the island's paperwork. The women weren't stepping in because something had gone wrong. They behaved as though this was exactly how the island was supposed to work. That was the part that didn't fit. This was still 19th century America. On most of the mainland, married women couldn't simply buy property, settle contracts, or make major financial decisions in their husband's name. So why did nobody in Nantucket seem surprised when it happened here? The island had left behind an answer inside the ledgers of the Pacific Bank. Banks have a habit of recording things people stop noticing. The first ledger seems ordinary enough. Most ledgers do. Banks aren't usually where childhood stories begin, but this one did. Then one detail started repeating itself. Every signature belonged to a woman. The pattern continued on the next page, then another, then another. After a while, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't one account. It wasn't one family. Page after page, the pattern repeated. At first, it looks exactly like the records of widows. It made perfect sense, until one name refused to cooperate. A woman had purchased property only weeks after her husband's ship had sailed, not after news of his death or after years of silence, while he was still somewhere beyond Cape Horn. Then the dates begin arguing with the assumption, the ship's departure, the property purchase. The numbers agree with each other. The assumption doesn't. The answer wasn't hidden. It had been sitting in the records the whole time. A document, a few signatures, barely more than a page. Before many voyages, husbands signed legal authority over to their wives before leaving the island. Not as an emergency measure. They weren't planning for tragedy. They were planning for Tuesday. Suddenly, none of it felt accidental anymore. The bakery hadn't opened because the men were gone. The bank hadn't stayed open despite the voyages. The island had been designed to survive them. Once the pattern becomes visible, the rest of Nantucket begins to make sense. The cooper keeps hammering barrels together. The bakery stays busy. Wagons continue rolling past the meeting house. A captain's wife finishes her business before the next customer steps forward. Nobody would have considered any of it impressive. Nobody whispered about independence. Nobody treated it as remarkable. Remarkable things stop looking remarkable once enough generations have grown up with them. The bakery, the counting house, the warehouse, none of them could afford to wait 4 years. The island would have starved long before then. Only then does Amelia's childhood begin to make sense. Not because she had explained the island, because she had never imagined it needed explaining. A visiting boy looked at her and asked, "Doesn't your mother miss your father?" Amelia frowned. "Of course she does." "Then why does he stay away so long?" She glanced toward the harbor, almost as if the answer was out there. Where else would he be? Somewhere beyond the horizon, Dozens of fathers were sleeping in hammocks no larger than coffins, while their children finished another ordinary school day without them. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then another child asked quietly, if fathers stayed home, who would catch the whales? The others looked at him with polite confusion, because the question itself didn't seem to belong on Nantucket. Someone called them home for supper. The children scattered. The conversation vanished with them. But it stayed with me. Children don't inherit explanations. They inherit habits. It's not so different today. Every family has rules. Children mistake for the way the whole world works. Nantucket's rules just happen to be harder for the rest of us to imagine. These children had inherited an entire way of understanding family. By the time the church bell marked another hour, another ship had already disappeared beyond the point. Hardly anyone watched it leave. Tomorrow another shop would open before sunrise. Another wife would unlock an office. Another child would wave goodbye without wondering why. The first rule of Nantucket had been there all along. Looking back, it leaves behind an uncomfortable question. If leaving was what made someone a father, what happened the day Amelia looked at the man who came home and realized he felt like a stranger? Another whale ship slipped beyond Brant Point. Amelia waved once, picked up the basket beside her, and walked back toward the bakery. By the time the sails had become little more than white marks against the Atlantic, she was already stacking warm loaves behind the counter. No one called her back. No one expected her to keep watching. One morning, two women paused outside the bakery. One asked quietly, "Was that before Thomas was born?" The other thought for a moment. No, his father was still in the Pacific. The conversation continued as though they'd mentioned the month of April. Amelia heard every word. Nothing about it sounded unusual. A cooper asked whether a fence had been repaired. Before Jonathan sailed, someone else answered, no, after the Pacific voyage. Amelia heard conversations like that every day. Someone was born before a voyage. Someone married after a Pacific voyage. A roof was repaired while a ship rounded Cape Horn. Years almost never appeared. She never noticed they were missing. Every few months, a packet ship arrived carrying letters. For a little while, doors opened, families gathered, kitchen tables grew quieter than churches. Ink crossed oceans where voices could not. Amelia's mother unfolded one letter carefully. "My dear Amelia, I hope you've started learning your letters." Amelia smiled. She reached for the page and read the rest aloud without stumbling once. Her mother folded the letter again. Neither of them said anything. Somewhere beyond Cape Horn, her father carefully folded the letter, believing a little girl would need her mother to read it aloud. He had no way of knowing she was already reading it herself. Amelia had never asked her father a question and heard the answer before the day was over. She had never interrupted one of his stories, never laughed while he was still telling the joke. Every conversation between them crossed an ocean first. She recognized her father's handwriting more easily than the sound of his voice. She never thought that was unusual. One afternoon, a visiting merchant from the mainland stopped outside the Cooper house. He smiled at Amelia. "Your father must be proud of you." Amelia nods. "He will be. When he comes home," he continued. She shakes her head gently. "When the letter reaches him." The merchant laughs softly, then realizes she isn't joking. He wasn't sure how to answer that. For the first time, it wasn't the visitor who sounded ordinary. It was Amelia, who belonged completely to the island. She never imagined there was another way to think. One afternoon, a little girl stood at the end of the wharf, crying as another whale ship prepared to leave. She clung to her father's coat with both hands. Around them, the harbor continued as it always had. Ropes tightened, barrels rolled across the docks. Crewmen shouted to one another. Nobody stopped working. Amelia watched for a moment, then walked over. She didn't tell the little girl everything would be all right. She simply said, "He'll come back after the voyage." The little girl looked at her through tears. "But I don't want him to go." Amelia hesitated. The answer seemed so obvious that she'd never needed to say it aloud before. "That's what fathers do." The crying slowly eased. Amelia squeezed the little girl's hand, then wandered back toward the harbor. Around them, the ropes were cast off. The sails caught the wind. Life continued exactly as it always had. By the time the little girl stopped crying, Amelia had already walked away. She never realized she had just taught someone else how to understand the world. One evening, Amelia looked up from the table. "Will father be home before winter?" Her mother kept kneading the dough. "I don't know." Amelia nodded and went back to eating. She never asked again. The ocean kept its own calendar. Families simply lived inside it. Supper was served. Bread was passed. Someone mentioned father's last letter. Then the conversation moved on. The empty chair wasn't ignored. It simply wasn't the center of the room anymore. Then one autumn, a family arrived from the mainland. Their son was about Amelia's age. He spoke about his father, the way children usually spoke about the weather. "He'll be home tonight." Amelia looked at him curiously. "Tonight?" He nodded. "He always comes home for supper." She studied his face, trying to decide whether he was joking. "Every night?" "Of course." For a long moment, neither child understood the other. The mainland boy couldn't imagine a father spending years at sea. Amelia couldn't imagine one walking through the front door every evening. Each believed the other had grown up in an impossible world. Neither child thought the other was unlucky. They simply couldn't imagine living inside the other's world. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another whale ship was already turning toward the open Atlantic. Almost no one watched until it disappeared. There was no reason to. Ships always left. One day, they came back. Nantucket never asked its children to believe fathers always left. It simply gave them a childhood where that belief never needed explaining. That was the world Amelia believed in, a world where fathers left and eventually returned. She had never imagined those could become two completely different things. For as long as Amelia could remember, every voyage ended the same way. The ships disappeared. Life continued. Then, one morning, they came home. No one knew the exact day, only that they always did. When the expected season arrived, people began glancing toward the harbor a little more often. Nobody stood waiting. Not yet. A baker still opened before sunrise. Blacksmiths still lit their fires. Children still carried baskets through the streets. The island had learned long ago that watching the horizon never made a ship sail faster. A week passed. Someone mentioned the weather. "The winds have been difficult." No one sounded worried, only patient. The sea had always kept its own calendar. Another week passed. They may have found another whale. The answer drifted through the bakery, as naturally as asking whether it might rain tomorrow. Bread was weighed. Coins changed hands. The oven stayed warm. Then the letters stopped. That had happened before. Sometimes storms scattered packet ships. Sometimes mail waited in another port. Sometimes an entire season seemed to disappear into the Atlantic. No one rushed to imagine the worst. People who lived beside the ocean learned patience long before they learned certainty. But something began happening that Amelia had not seen for years. Children returned to the harbor. No one had called them there. No one could tell them when the waiting would end. Amelia found herself standing where she hadn't stood for years. The same wooden pilings, the same salt air, the same stretch of empty horizon. She couldn't remember the last time she'd waited for a ship to appear. Without realizing it, she had begun waiting again. Around her, other children searched the horizon in silence. No games, no laughter, only eyes fixed on the sea. It was a sight Nantucket had not seen for a very long time. The children hadn't changed, certainty had. For the first time, grown-ups stopped speaking in promises. If the weather turns, perhaps next week, maybe they're farther south. Small words. Yet Amelia couldn't remember hearing them attached to fathers before. Until then, every voyage had felt like a promise. Now, it felt like a question. One evening she asked quietly, "Will father be home before winter?" Her mother looked toward the window. The answer didn't come immediately. "I hope so." Amelia had never heard her mother answer that way before. Then, before anyone expected certainty to return, someone claimed they had seen a sail. The harbor filled before sunrise. No one had seen the ship. Someone thought they had. That was enough. Shop doors opened late. Bread cooled on wooden shelves. Work could wait. Hope could not. Then, far beyond the mouth of the harbor, a sail appeared. No one cheered. Not yet. People had learned not to celebrate shapes on the horizon. The sea had fooled them before. But as the hours passed, the outline grew clearer. Another mast, then another, until there was no mistaking it. A whale ship was coming home. Families drifted toward the docks, not running, simply walking faster than usual. Children squeezed between adults. Mothers searched every face aboard the approaching ship. The island had rehearsed this moment for generations. No two homecomings were ever the same. When the first boats reached the wharf, the crew stepped ashore, one by one, older, thinner, sunburned, bearded. Each man carried years the island had never seen. Then Amelia saw him. She knew it was her father before anyone spoke, because she had spent years searching every letter for the man who wrote it. He smiled immediately. Amelia. She knew the name instantly. Somehow, hearing it spoken felt stranger than reading it. He opened his arms. She took a step forward, then stopped. She had never learned what came after goodbye. She knew how to wave goodbye. She knew how to unfold his letters. She knew how to imagine him somewhere beyond the horizon. She had never imagined him standing here. Her father lowered his arms, not in disappointment, in understanding. He crossed the last few steps himself and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, two people who had never stopped loving each other, trying to recognize the years that had happened somewhere else. He remembered the little girl who needed lifting onto the bakery counter, the child who laughed whenever flour covered her nose, the daughter who waved until his ship disappeared beyond Brant Point. She remembered careful handwriting, folded letters, stories that arrived months after they happened, a signature she could recognize instantly, a voice she was still trying to remember. Neither of them had become the person the other expected. Neither of them was wrong. The ocean had simply asked them to grow up apart. The strange thing wasn't that her father had come home. It was that now, for the first time in her life, she had to learn how to have one. He wasn't another letter. He wasn't away on another voyage. He was suddenly there, at breakfast, at supper, walking beside her, through streets she had always walked without him. For years, she had known exactly where his letters belonged. Now she had to decide where he should sit at the supper table, and that turned out to be a journey neither of them had expected. For years, their relationship had lived inside letters. Now it had to live inside ordinary mornings. He asked if she would walk with him to the harbor. She did. They reached the docks and found there was almost nothing to say. For years, he had imagined these conversations. Out at sea, he had pictured the questions he would ask, the stories he would tell, the afternoons they would share. Standing beside her at last, those words seemed strangely difficult to find. Amelia felt it too. She knew how to wait for her father. She knew how to read his handwriting. She knew how to fold every letter carefully before placing it back inside its envelope. She did not know how to walk beside him every day. One morning, he reminded her to bring a shawl before leaving the house. She paused. No one had ever told her that before. Her mother simply trusted her to remember. She smiled politely, then forgot the shawl anyway. Both of them laughed. It was a tiny moment, but it belonged to neither of their memories. It was the first one they had made together. He helped carry flour into the bakery, fixed a loose shutter, sat in the chair that had waited years for him. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, everyone noticed it without saying so. Sometimes he still caught himself reaching for the little girl he remembered. Then Amelia would answer with the calm confidence of a young woman who had learned to live without him. Neither version was wrong. They simply belonged to different years. One evening, he asked whether she still kept the shells he'd given her before sailing. She looked puzzled. "I don't remember those." He nodded quietly. She couldn't remember. She remembered something else instead. The careful curve of his handwriting. The way every letter began. "My dear Amelia." She had read those words so many times, they had become more familiar than the sound of his voice. As the months passed, the conversations came more easily. The silences grew shorter. Little by little, they stopped feeling like people catching up. They simply became a father and his daughter. They had only just begun becoming a family when the world beyond Nantucket began changing again. Whale oil no longer lit every city. Steam replaced sail. California promised fortunes. The Pacific no longer could. Young men who might once have signed onto whale ships began chasing different horizons instead. The names changed. The destinations changed. The leaving didn't. When Amelia was a little girl, she believed fathers left because they were whalers. Years later, she understood something else. The sea had never been the reason. History simply kept finding new horizons. Somewhere in Nantucket, another child stood at the harbor. A father waved once. The child waved back, then turned toward home before the ship had disappeared. No one had taught the child to do that, just as no one had taught Amelia. Some lessons are never spoken. Children simply inherit the explanations a place gives them, until one day they mistake them for the way the world has always been.